So hi everybody, my name is Abidar. I'm the programming director at Hamilton Artists Inc. For those of you that don't know, Hamilton Artists Inc. is a charitable, not-for-profit artist-run center based in Hamilton, Ontario, and we were founded in 1975. For the last 45 years, the Inc. has and continues to offer an alternative to commercial spaces and established public galleries by providing artists with opportunities for critical engagement, exploration, and risk-taking. Our exhibitions, publications, and special projects offer education and mentorship. They facilitate local and regional dialogue and encourage collaboration, conversation, and critical inquiry. Our programs are free and open to everyone. Thank you all for joining us for our first online artist talk. This talk will be about 45 minutes and then a little audience Q&A at the end, so no more than an hour for the whole thing. To ask questions, you can either type in the box at the bottom there or use the question function within Instagram Live, so whichever one is more comfortable for you. I'm really happy to welcome our winter exhibiting artist, Nahed Mansour, who's here to speak with artist and curator Swapnaa Tamhane, who will join once I leave. Swapnaa has written a beautiful text on Nahed's work. I encourage you all to check it out after the talk. It's available for free on our website through the link in Hamilton Artists Inc.'s bio. Nahed's exhibition, Little Egypt Doesn't Dance Here Anymore, was on view at Hamilton Artists Inc. from February 8th to March 14th this year. The exhibition consisted of 7 works, lots of different media and different sizes of works, and Nahed and Swapnaa will go more in depth into that, but I just want to tell you that the works included 2 large carbon transfer drawings, an installation made up of 100 $1 US bills that were displayed in the shape of a pyramid, a video work that was made up entirely of found footage, a selection of material culture and archival images that referenced Little Egypt. You can see images of the works that were in the exhibition on Hamilton Artists Inc.'s Instagram profile, but there's also exhibition documentation on our website through the link in Hamilton Artists Inc.'s bio. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Nahed and Swapnaa. Nahed Mansour is a Toronto-based artist that works between video, installation, drawing, and performance. Her research-based practice draws from archival images, found footage, and material culture to investigate notions of race and power through dance. Hi, Nahed.
Hi.
Swapnaa Tamhane is an artist, curator, and writer. She has curated exhibitions at Museum Abteiberg in Germany, the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto, and Tamhane was an international fellow with the German Cultural Federal Foundation in 2013. Her visual practice is dedicated to decolonizing drawing in an attempt to reframe an understanding of form and line. Her process focuses on the presence of her hand in making paper and the treatment of surfaces. She has exhibited her work at Space Gallery in Toronto, Leonard Ellen Bina Gallery in Montreal, Serendipity Arts Festival in Goa, and has upcoming exhibitions at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto and the Sculpture Park, Jaipur. So I'm really happy to welcome you, Nahed, and I'm going to leave now so that Swapnaa can hop on. And thank you all so much for joining us for this talk. Bye now.
Hi, thank you. So I'm just going to be adding Swapnaa to this conversation, and please be patient with me. This is my first Instagram Live. This is my first almost Instagram anything. So here's Swapnaa, and I'll add her in.
Hi.
We did it.
Yeah. Hi, Nahed. Thank you for doing this. This is both of our first times doing an Instagram Live. Thanks.
Thank you, Swapnaa, so much for doing this with me, and also thank you, Abidar and Hamilton Artists Inc. for organizing this and having us be having this conversation online during these troubling times. I hope everyone is doing well. Yeah, so let's try to have this conversation on this new platform for us.
Yeah, thank you, Abidar, and thank you, Hamilton Artists Inc. And thank you for asking me to write about your work. I was really happy to revisit it. The first time I'd kind of well, I worked with you for the Aga Khan Museum exhibition in 2017 for the exhibition here locating contemporary Canadian artists, and was the inclusion of this one part of this kind of larger body of work from Little Egypt Doesn't Dance Here Anymore. And that inclusion was, I mean, there were 23 artists in that show, so in a sense it's quite exciting to see how Little Egypt has kind of the entire body of work, to see it as its sort of fullness, which I had the chance to see at Articule in Montreal. And unfortunately I haven't seen the Hamilton Artists Inc. exhibition, but maybe before we sort of launch into questions, Nahed, can you talk a little bit about the figure of Little Egypt and, you know, how you kind of came across it to begin with?
For sure. So in the last, I would say 10 years, my practice has really kind of shifted in terms of what I'm looking at and researching. And I've been really focusing all my, you know, the works that I've been doing over the last 10 years really around this relationship between entertainment, power, and dance. And I come to that as someone who has a background in dance and just been really always fascinated with popular culture. And so for myself, as an Arab who grew up in the Middle East, I've seen so many representations of Arab female bodies and belly dancers in American popular culture. And I've always been kind of fascinated by those representations. I've also seen representations of belly dancers also in Egyptian films that I also kind of watch. And I've been really interested in this figure of a belly dancer and all that she represents for a really long time. So it's something that's been percolating in my head for a while. But Little Egypt really kind of started to form as a project, and a project that kind of expanded into a series of works that are in dialogue with one another. When I was really trying to answer this question of when was the first time belly dancing came to North America? Like, where are all these images? What are they referencing? Like, what is this moment that brought belly dancing to American mass kind of popular culture? And a text that was really crucial for my understanding was this text by Sunaina Maria titled Belly Dance, Arab Face, American Feminism and US Empire. And that text that blew my mind and kind of paved the way for this investigation. I'll speak about that text in a bit, but essentially when I was looking for this first moment where belly dancing is brought to North America, of course, the answer is somewhere in the World Fair of Chicago in 1893. And it makes total sense that this happens at a World Fair. We know a lot about World Fairs and all what they represent, but really one crucial thing they represent is this kind of perceived superiority complex of the West and in this case, North America. And there's this like supremacy that is in contrast to the pavilions of other nations and showcasing their backwardness and all this kind of stuff. And Little Egypt is a dancer, a belly dancer, who premieres this new form of shaking her midsection in the street of Cairo Pavilion. And I became really fascinated by her, but in trying to find out more about her, I find more and more copies of her. And I realized the project is really in trying to find one Little Egypt. This notion of authenticity is just kind of shattered. And in trying to find Little Egypt, I find all her shadows, and which continue to today, and like she just keeps getting multiplied. And I'm realizing I'm finding her in music, I'm finding her in like costumes, I'm finding her in dance, I'm finding her in cinema. I'm finding her everywhere. And she's like, you know, when you learn a new word and you start seeing that word everywhere and you're like, how come I never knew that word before? It was the same with Little Egypt. Like she is, I hope after today, you also start to see her.
I mean, I did a little bit with, you know, so your video, Little Egypt Doesn't Dance Here Anymore. So it includes like a series of sort of a collage of found footage. And it is interesting to think about the sort of debasement or like a low moral value that's associated with belly dancing or with this kind of free figure, you know, who is sexually free, is showing her midriff. Like this is, you know, this is, especially in American culture, this is really, it's like the tantalizing female, you know, who will take you to like the other side in a sense. And I was surprised to see like the Coaster song, the Little Egypt Yin Yang, and then the Elvis cover, and even Cher in The Mask, who kind of does, you know, just this sort of appropriation of these sort of forms that were rooted in like folk dance and had come from, yeah, like maybe you can talk a little bit about Raqs al-Sharqi, which is its proper name for belly dancing. So there's Gavazi and there was Raqs al-Sharqi, and maybe you can just tell our audiences like what it was, because in the exhibition at the Aga Khan Museum, there was the inclusion of several drawings on carbon paper, and there was also an image from the 1893 World Fair of a group of Victorian women who were having a meeting to try to stop the performance of Little Egypt. And alongside that, which I don't know if you've included in this exhibition, is an image of the muscles that are in the womb, which are used for belly dancing. I've sort of answered the question I was asking you. Sorry. Yeah. So maybe you could talk a little bit about like it's more than just, you know, a movement and of the belly, and I think that the way it kind of got appropriated, it lost its sort of magic and its importance.
Yeah, I mean, in trying to search for like Little Egypt as this iconic dancer who many of us are either knowingly or unknowingly kind of referencing and sometimes like mimic ourselves, in trying to find out more about her, I also see how this like there's this like replication and doubling and tripling and kind of expanding out not only of her as a figure, but also as the dance. And you're right, like there's so many different names for belly dancing, like danse du ventre, obviously in French, Shastri, hoochie coochie, snake dance. You just get all these different kind of variations also of terms and what they represent. And you could also see how that expands kind of more globally in who has access to this new dance form. But you're right, this I do have included in this exhibition this image, archival image of the Board of Lady Managers. And essentially at the World Fair, when Little Egypt was performing on the street of Cairo, her dance was, you know, not something that was what people were ready for. So, you know, this is like Victorian era. All the ladies are in, you know, tight corsets. Their bodies are heavily controlled. They are fully covered. And then comes this Little Egypt dancer who is just shaking her midsection in a way that hasn't been seen before, and also showing skin that hasn't been seen in public before. And actually what's really interesting about that is that during the Chicago World Fair, it actually was not well attended, and they were really close to, they were losing lots of money and close to bankruptcy, and it was a financial disaster. And it was only with Little Egypt where actually people in kind of rumors about this dancer who is doing this like new dance form, more and more people started to flock to Chicago to see this dance. So there's something there about the male gaze and about you know, money and profit and exploitation, that's just like all kind of wrapped up in the story from the get-go. And although like Little Egypt really did, I see her as this like hero who did save like the World Fair from this like financial ruin. The Board of Lady Managers were predominantly the wives of a lot of the promoters of the festival. And they were, as you know, white upper class women starting to gain new rights, and they were showing, you know, some of their privileges in society by forming these kind of social clubs and social groups. And they were in charge with a lot of like social events related to the fair. But as soon as they like realize that all the men are flocking to the fair to see this scandalous woman who's showing a part of her body that is not to be seen, they, you know, they really worked hard and organized to try to get her banned from the fair. And I found that like such an amazing moment of, for me, like such a, you know, a moment that really defines like white liberal feminism and its relationship to the other bodies, like female bodies, and this form of, you know, righteousness and superiority of like asserting what you believe is true. And of course, like today, I mentioned Sonaina Maria's amazing article about belly dance and Araface, U.S. feminism and American feminism and U.S. empire. But in that text, you know, Maria looks at the rise of belly dance studios in the United States during the War on Terror. And she talks about how at this time where Arabs are being demonized and you know, targeted, there's this other kind of fascination and, you know, wanting to become, you know, the other during this moment. So that happens simultaneously. And I find that really like fascinating. I continue to find that really fascinating. At this like the highest moment of US empire, you see this engagement and mimicry become really common. And yeah, I think there's something there about appropriation, but also about the commercialization of appropriation and assertion of supremacy on the other bodies.
There's this this body of work is just, it touches on so many amazing points between media, between censorship, appropriation, mimicry, you know, your interest in authenticity, the representation of the female body on screen, and then it goes like also your interest in terms of media and these moments of like military presence, you know, that which we were talking about in sort of preparation for this talk. I'm just thinking now, like this idea of this little Egypt who is not one but several women from the fair, but then you know, which you've drawn in these beautiful large, they're drawings on white paper, but they're all scaled quite differently. And you know, you've included like not just the women from the 1893 fair in Chicago, but also all the sort of iterations of women who've interpreted belly dance or have, you know, appropriated it from American American popular culture, from Rhonda Fleming. And then, so there's those drawings on the white paper where you can see them quite clearly. And then the drawings that are on the carbon paper are almost like white shadows in which you've created this sort of amazing inverse. And there becomes a play where you start to understand that something's not totally aligned with this authentic, you know, representation of the belly dancer. And in some cases also from just doing some research, like some of the dancers who were at the fair were not actually even Egyptian. Like there was, you know, there was a Greek restaurateur's wife that was included. But I wanted to talk a little bit about like this representation of women on screen and thinking about censorship and a relationship to, you know, early forms of, so we both have a shared history of growing up in the Middle East and have a very clear understanding as a child that there was constant censorship in anything that you would have encountered that was coming in from the West. And I think in thinking about dance, film, and gender, and like women on screen, there's the Thomas Edison film that had premiered, or he was premiering his kinetoscope at this 1893 fair, and included it is this dancer named Fatima, and these sort of bars that are over her midriff, so you can still see her dancing, but there are bars over her midriff. So I wanted to maybe ask you a little about your relationship to censorship and thinking about moving image and censorship.
Thinking about, sorry, what was the last?
About moving image.
Oh, moving, yeah. So, I mean, the research for this project was so fascinating. It literally the research was done very, very slowly along with, you know, life. for about 9 years. And
wow.
I kept getting lost in the research, and I just was like, should I just do a PhD about Little Egypt, because I'm like fascinated. And it took me so long to figure out like, how am I going to make this story, like what is my like what more can I do? The story is so fascinating, there's nothing really I could really add to it. And that's when I realized actually I shouldn't be inserting myself so directly. Really, the art is in the like replication, in the, you know, I should use the found image, I should use the found footage, I should use the archival material, I should just use what's there and try to tell the story by just presenting a bunch of material together, in order to kind of hint at these different kind of moments that I realized that Little Egypt's story is so rich with not only like discussions about imperialism, exploitation, race, gender.
Yeah.
There's so many things, but you're right, like censorship really came to the forefront when I realized that the film that you say, this early film by Thomas Edison, of Fatma's Dance, which if you just go on YouTube and look up, you know, Little Egypt, Edison, you'll see like a 2-minute clip, which is amazing. But what's really interesting is when you play that, like 30 seconds in, you're right, this bar comes in and her midsection is covered in these lines. And it's a very strange, it took me a while to like figure out that's censorship, and that's like meant to be covering her midsection. It just looks quite strange. To me, it actually looked like, you know, bars of like, you know, the way musical notes are written or something like that. There's something very musical in it. But it really was this censorship. And it's actually the first film to be censored. And I found like, I found that really intriguing as well. In terms of, yeah, my relationship to censorship, I think again, it's, you know, this obvious, you know, it's who is deciding what parts are, you know, what parts of a female's body are being shown, which parts are not, and all this kind of, again, goes into this perceived superiority that it would take for someone to decide on behalf of someone else how they should be presenting themselves. And the work, as you know, as in the exhibition, is talking about U.S. empire, and you know, obviously today the what we're talking about with censorship is in reverse. So a lot of U.S. empire and, you know, America's invasion of like Afghanistan, for example, there's so much about, you know, this going to liberate women and all this kind of extreme, you know, contrast to Little Egypt and American superiority in trying to dress her and civilize her, essentially by covering her up. And right now it's kind of this reversed narration of control, again, of the woman's body and deciding how they should be seen. But in terms of my practice, again, going back to like all the material I was presented with and being quite lost in figuring out, you know, how to move forward and how to tell this story in a way that doesn't, I didn't want to retell the story. I wanted to present all these elements for the story to tell itself, or at least parts of it to be kind of revealed. And for me, like a big part was also landing on this notion of profit. And so, like I mentioned, the fact that, you know, Little Egypt was the most profitable kind of part of the pavilion, and her connection to money was just really a really interesting kind of moment, and one that I kind of make all these different works about. So
yeah, can you maybe talk a little bit about like how you decided to use carbon paper then, and what carbon paper signifies? Because I think in the West it's not the same. The materiality is quite, you know, the symbolism is quite different. So in thinking, because I can imagine as you're going through this process of research, you know, it is like a PhD. There's so much, and it, you know, it's been such a pleasure to learn alongside, but then also think about these influences of, you know, why you're using found footage, for instance, which I'd like you to also speak about, and how kind of the influence of, like, for instance, when the military, you know, arrived in sorry, arrived is not the right word, when they sort of kind of landed into Saudi Arabia in 1990. Yeah, it is so rich. So I wonder, you know, your kind of process in building this exhibition and thinking about materiality between, you know, archival image, found footage, and then using things like to draw directly on money or to use something like carbon paper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in the exhibition, there's, you know, there's a work that's 100 $1 bills, and on each of them there are essentially 100 different portraits of different dancers that I found during my research. And that piece specifically was like, whenever I was researching Little Egypt and I would find an image referencing a woman who was either like using that name to promote herself, because there was also money to be made in claiming you were Little Egypt. So, you know, that moniker was widely used and continues to be used. But whenever I would find, you know, an image through the research, I would just photocopy it and like file it. And I realized like very quickly that that portfolio of like photocopied images was growing and growing. And I realized like I need to figure out an endpoint to this. And I just decided I would just stop at 100. And so when I collected 100 images of Little Egypt through the research, I decided to just to use, I wasn't sure how to draw them. Like I was just like, okay, what would it mean if I just start to draw this woman? It didn't really connect, and it didn't add any value to what, like, the story I wanted to present. And I really landed on, you know, when I landed on carbon paper and I realized, oh yeah, that is the material. That's like, that is the piece. Like all I'm really doing in that work is just introducing carbon paper. And you're right, the connotation there with carbon paper as a material that's, you know, used at, like, for receipts when writing, you know, when having any monetary exchange, especially in the Middle East and in South Asia and other parts of the world. Like when I see carbon paper, I just see an exchange, and I see often, you know, a monetary exchange. And I thought, and for me, I was just like, oh, okay, if I draw through tracing Little Egypt, these photocopied images that I'm finding of her, I'm realizing that in tracing her, I'm like trying to pinpoint her and find her and locate her in this like search for Little Egypt. But while I'm tracing her and like kind of capturing her, I'm actually quite literally erasing her when using carbon paper, right? So it's like the negative. Wow. So there's this kind of like hide and seek that I've had with Little Egypt for almost 10 years, and just trying to pin her down, but she just, you know, appears elsewhere, and she doubles, and she like keeps doubling. And that's really the story of Little Egypt, or the story, like, it's just a microcosm for like the story that I found. So transfer paper was really important as a material, but also, I mean, there's also like kind of personal elements. My grandfather used to run and work on like a paper, like he was in the paper business, and he had like, it was so fun to like go visit him. You just open up a cupboard, like paper would spill in every color, every thickness, every like, it was just amazing. And he was a really artistic and creative person, and he had all this paper. And I remember being most fascinated by paper that would like sticky paper. And we would just cut them out in different shapes and kind of essentially make our own stickers. And the one kind of my like fondest memory was when like one year I was living in Saudi Arabia, and we went to visit my grandparents in Alexandria. And we went, and the VHS tapes, which were in the living room, and of course like VHS tapes are like every kid from like, you know, 80s, early 90s, like, you know, that's where our life was. At least my life was like, just because of like the lack of channels in the Middle East, until, you're right, like and anyway, there's like all this paper. And my fondest memory was when I went to go see the VHS tape collection that I was so used to kind of watching. And my grandfather had essentially like made like color coded all his VHS tapes using this like paper. And I actually, I had only realized like how important that was to me when I like realized that on my website, subconsciously in my about section, there's an image of that like VHS, my grandfather's like VHS tape collection, which is really where my life is, because it's where all the representations of other worlds like were presented to me. And you know, we would go like 6 months to a year without seeing our grandparents, and like he, instead of like writing, you know, letters to one another, my grandfather would be like recording you know, different like things on VHS tapes, and we would come and be like, what did you record for us? And we would watch like everything we've missed on TV since the last time we had visited.
Can you maybe just give some background, because like the value of a VHS tape, while and also the exchange, and then the recording over, and then the clips, and then maybe you can talk a little bit about that relationship kind of leading into how you use found footage, because I think it's a very different relationship. Like there's also, you know, there's a tradition of found footage amongst video artists, but I think the way that you've come to it is very specific, and it's very rooted, I think, in that, you know, relationship to wanting access to Western culture or any other culture, because it wasn't available in these compounds. So can you just maybe make that
Sure. Yeah, so I grew up in Saudi Arabia in an American compound called Aramco. It's a huge company that produces oil in the Middle East. And essentially this compound is like a gated community. And although it is in Saudi Arabia, everything that happens within the compound is looks more like what would happen in American suburbs. So a lot of the rules are laxed for the Americans to enjoy what they would perceive as a more kind of American lifestyle. So there's swimming pools, there's movie theaters, there's all these areas of public gathering that aren't typical or allowed in Saudi Arabia. And I mean, there was one movie theater there, and it was like this joke, because you would go to watch a film that had come out like 5-6 years ago. And that you know, that space between when something, you know, premieres you know, in the West, and when it comes to theater, it's not only like there's an added kind of time of that's because of censorship, right? And in order to edit down any kind of overly sexual like content of these movies. So lots of movies that I grew up watching were about like 20 to 30 minutes shorter in length than the actual movie. And like I've watched like many endings, and I was like, oh, that's how it concludes. Okay, cool. So there's like definitely this space of time and feeling like you're getting things and you're excited to get them, but they're outdated and they're like not cool anymore and all this kind of stuff. But at home, that was like the theater. But at home, again, like the you know, on TV, there's only one channel, Channel 3, and
which was the Aramco television.
Aramco television,
which also had censorship.
Yeah,
and it was both in English and Arabic.
Yeah, and I mean, it would only start because in the compound, you're only in the compound if you are employed by Aramco, or maybe it's someone who's employed, or the kid of that. Like, so it's just like everyone is, you know, connected to the company. And because of that, everyone is like working all day long and in school. So the channel would only start like at 4 o'clock. And there'd be a countdown before 4 o'clock when like TV goes like live and you like can see something. Otherwise it's like a blank blue screen. So there's something about just like waiting for the TV to come on, even though the TV was already on, but just like waiting for content. But, you know, there was this thing of, you know, me and my brothers would just be like, the VHS tape was everything, because that was like who was in control. And we would just be like, I was like, I'm going to record Full House, like, leave me alone. And, you know, and they're like, you know, we're going to, I don't know, record America's Funniest Home Videos or whatever it was. And just like the VHS tape allowed us to continue watching before the channel showed any content. So we were able to like extend our watching hours because of the VHS tape. And in terms of like movies, the few movies that we had on VHS tape, like, you know, I've memorized line by line because we just watched them over and over again. And I think, like, for me, definitely my practice in using found footage, and not necessarily, I really don't really shoot video myself. Like, I just use what's there. It's very resourceful. And I think it does, you know, replicate the, you know, my relationship with popular culture and trying to be resourceful with it. So it's like, this movie I really like, it's only going to be showing once. For sure, it might be 20 minutes, like less in length and like other things, but I need to record it so I could watch it again. And I still kind of have that mentality of just like, I'm going to use the found footage I find on YouTube. You know, it might not be amazing, like audio, it might be glitchy, other things, but I'll just use it. And that's kind of the style in my relationship with my video work in general, is just to use like what I have.
Yeah, because so the video that you've included in Little Egypt doesn't dance here anymore in your exhibition. So for me, that really is like what sort of holds everything together in a sense. So, you know, in your exhibition, there's drawings, there's archival material, and then there's this video that is quite sort of, it's also interesting how you like move between those clips that you've taken. They're sort of inserted and then like sort of rejected and then inserted again, and it's like this sort of song, this very popular song from the Coasters from 1962 that's like really annoyingly like stays in your head through the whole thing. And then of course there are these beautiful drawings of the carbon paper and like this kind of frayed line, and it was interesting to think about, like, it didn't really, I think when I was thinking about censorship and then the VHS tape, then it was like, it made sense why you made those decisions to use, you know, something that was like already like ready made in a way. And that also kind of speaks about appropriation in such a clear way. And this is what I love about this whole body of work, is that you kind of take appropriation, like you turn it on its head and sort of make fun back at it, in the way that it's, you know, there's this kind of like extraction from the East, and then the way it kind of comes into the West, and just thinking about like, so just reading about in Edward Said's Orientalism, he speaks about this Gustave Flaubert novel, what's it? Kunshuk Hanem, who was a very famous Gawazi dancer, which is, you know, an indigenous form of belly dancing. And that was written in like the early 1800s. And that kind of influenced this whole like Orientalist symbolist tradition, even within painting. And it's amazing to see that same representation, because the images that you've used, for instance, on the carbon drawings, like they still have that same feeling. But then I love when you notice that it's, and you should talk a little bit about coming across that movie Little Egypt with Rhonda Fleming. Like when you see her body in comparison to the Little Egypt dancers from the fair, the costuming, like the jewelry, the body posture, the movement, the whole, like even her sort of thinness compared to like this kind of largeness of these, I don't know what, they're not Egyptian, so the original dancers. And then that film is also playing in your exhibition, the one with Rhonda Fleming, but it's silenced, like there's no sound, so you just have this kind of imagery. Can you talk a little bit about how you came across the film with Rhonda Fleming, and why you also chose not to include any sound?
I mean, the Rhonda Fleming film was really interesting to me in that for me, I found that film, I tried to kind of flatten it the same way the images of all the other Little Egypts in the exhibition are flattened. So just really looking at the visual and concentrating on the visual, and also concentrating on the gestures and the costume, and the poses, and so there's I wanted it to be kind of at the same level of all the other different images of Little Egypt in the exhibition. So, I mean, Little Egypt doesn't dance here anymore. It's like, you know, there's this one Little Egypt and you're trying to find her, but she's not there anymore. But in the exhibition itself, there are probably like between 120 to 150 different representations of Little Egypt in the exhibition itself. So Rhonda Fleming is like a very popular one that many people would recognize. But in the exhibition, I really wanted to have this diversity of representation with icons that would be recognizable versus those who, you know, are unnamed, like these Gowezi dancers who are, like you're saying, the more indigenous kind of older traditional style of belly dancing who are often unnamed versus, you know, Elvis Presley, Cher, and kind of other, you know, pop, you know, mass like, you know, pop icons that everyone recognizes. And so there, like that variation was really important. But to answer your question about, you know, about thinking about Little Egypt and I forgot my train of thought here.
The film.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I wanted to say that, like, in thinking about belly dancing and like between Gowezi dancers, which, you know, is an older, more traditional form versus belly dancing, because there's a lot of imagery of belly dancers that are only, say, like 30, 40 years old in the show. So it goes from 1893 to around 1990 and showing like all the different types of Little Egypts there are in this like 100-year span. And I realized in my project, I wasn't trying to research the authentic and research like traditional dancing and things like this in the Middle East. I was really interested in what, like, the mimicry aspect and imitation and what is being produced in order to be consumed. And that's really like that commodification that just goes hand in hand with American culture and American kind of consumerism. And so that's where I really kind of focused my research. But I also realized that I wasn't really interested in figuring out, I wasn't learning about the Middle East by looking at the like figure of the belly dancer. I was learning about, like, I was seeing America represent itself through its appropriation of an other. And so there's this total reversal where you learn more about like American empire and American dominance and American kind of identity and national, like the national projected identity when you see how it imitates an other. And I found that really, really an interesting kind of thing to figure out, was that this research like really taught me about American empire. And I think so much of the work really kind of speaks to that. But, you know, another text that really fascinated me when I made that connection was a text by Susan Nance, who has this incredible book called How the Arabian Nights Influenced the American Dream. And she connects or like American Orientalist fascination with the East and the riches of the East, like the wealth and the harems and the sheikhs and all this stuff, with early hyper-capitalist kind of goals and relationship to capital, wealth, and consumerism in the United States. So actually this reversal, like while I'm looking at North America kind of copying these dancers like of the Middle East, they're also copying lots of things around wealth. And mostly like they're not copying it, they're projecting and copying their own projections of like of wealth, of circulation, of commodification, and of exploitation. There's like a lot happening there beyond just the figure, but also about the wealth to be made off of the body of the figure.
The same kind of thing continues though from Flaubert's representation of Kenshuk Hanem to where he speaks about, like, in the Orientalist tradition, that the body is spoken for and represented for, and like that continues even through you know, kind of coming through like French painting to America, like what you're saying with American empire. It's still this situation of being spoken for in that process of appropriation. but I think in your exhibition, like you're flipping it on its head. So there's almost like a reclaim of power, and then showing that back in a sense, by making fun of it, but also in a sense, you know, these are very beautiful drawings, and the scale keeps kind of changing between the figures, and it's you can't really like, as it's kind of interesting. This is the first time I've heard you say that you, every time you were drawing it, you're almost like losing Little Egypt, because you do have that sense that you can't quite grasp what this thing is and what this figure is. But then I still feel that there's this like the ultimate, thing that happens with appropriation is that it's spoken for and it's transforms into something that it's not anymore. So in researching for, you know, for writing this essay on your exhibition, I learned that in 2003, the Egyptian government wanted to create a ban that any foreign dancers, there's a lot of foreign dancers who come from America, from Russia, like they'll come to Egypt and they want to perform belly dancing, but often there's like a lot of other politics around that. So the Egyptian government wanted to reclaim and sort of reappropriate what is indigenous to them. And of course, this didn't last very long. I think they tried to implement it by January 2004, and then it ended, you know, that same year in August. So I wanted to ask you, like, well, how do you feel about that kind of process of reappropriation? So kind of like the whole, it's just amazing this body can represent so much.
Yeah, like the connotation of belly dance, like in, like for sure in Egypt is like, there's always, you know, I don't know, like they're desired, but scandalous and immoral and all this kind of stuff, which is no different than, you know, the Board of Lady Managers and their take on Little Egypt at that time. So I don't think there's any representation of, or at least in this work, there's not really representation of the belly dancer that is honest or that is truthful to who a belly dancer is, because they are all voiceless women who aren't speaking on their own and being represented behind the camera, whether it's Edison or male directors today who want to project their own like sexual fantasies on these women, etc. Like their voice, you know, Little Egypt doesn't dance here anymore, and as an exhibition just presents the male gaze on these dancers with that kind of dominance over them from the start. There are different, there are some moments where you can see this like looking back or flipping of the gaze or moments of empowerment, but really in trying not to like assert too much of my own voice into this project and just presenting the material as I find it, definitely that lack of voice is definitely there. But the connotation of, you know, belly dance continues to be this way in the Middle East. And you're right, like the reason why, like, of course, there's like Egyptian dancers and, you know, you belly dance in weddings and other kind of moments of celebration. But if one is to be like a dancer in a nightclub or in a hotel, dancing for an audience, a wealthy audience, like there are typically like, you know, dancers from other parts of the world. Right now, I think probably mostly Eastern European, but there's a lot there in terms of who dances and who is congratulated for dancing and like admired as a dancer, and the technique of belly dancing is so incredible. It's like an art form like any other art form that has this like very aggressive sexualized like connotations to it that takes away from really the technique of belly dancing as an art form that is to be admired. So I mean, in terms of like, my partner yesterday told me that a woman in Egypt was like imprisoned yesterday for, she's a belly dancer who's imprisoned for uploading something on TikTok. I need to look into it more, but there's like a lot of belly dancers get into trouble and get imprisoned and get censored, and you know, that's always there. So I don't think a reclamation of the belly dancer as a figure that is like respected is really ever like is really there. It's the connotation of saying, like myself, you know, I grew up dancing like tap and jazz, and I could just probably say like, oh, I take ballet class, I take tap class, like that's okay. But I wouldn't go around and say like, oh, I'm belly dancing. Like that would just, I mean, I could and I would be happy to do so, but the connotation there is like sexualized in the Middle East, same way sexualized in the like the West, right? So there's always that.
But I mean, originally it wasn't, and they also generated quite a lot of income. Like they were taxed as well. So I mean, it's just interesting also the way that this tradition of Raqs al-Sharqi or belly dancing was like through the change of political governments and culture has also been sort of affected. I think I mean this is we're like this is such a fascinating and rich area of not only like research but imagery, and it just weaves into like cinema in this kind of amazing way, and it weaves into like global exchange in a really strange way as well. I just like I don't know, there's there's kind of these like main topics that we've discussed, but like is there like one thing that just stands out for you as like what sort of really pulled, like what you've almost, I wanted to ask you for like one word, but that's kind of stupid. So maybe like what you've learned from this process of research of 9 years, and then even in your process of like creating a visual art exhibition around it, like what you've learned from that.
The title itself, I should say, is one it took me a while to kind of come to, but it really says a lot in the title. Little Egypt doesn't dance here anymore. I find it a very sad title. I find it to speak about this loss of kind of what we were talking about before, like a dance form that is, respected and, should be kind of going hand in hand with like, a national dance form that is celebrated. And I find that, she doesn't dance here for different reasons. And she's not allowed to dance in the first place. And the only people who are allowed to dance like her or, claim to be her are like in Sinaina Maria's piece, like white, women who want to belly dance to, for all the different reasons. And yeah, there's like many reasons, but like in terms of who is able to do this dance form and who is able to mimic, it is much easier for some than others. And I think there's like a definite reversal there that's quite specific to belly dance. But in terms of like where that comes from, Little Egypt Doesn't Dance Here Anymore is a lyric from the Yin Yan song in Elvis Presley's performance of the song, originally, sung by the Coasters. And essentially, like in that song, it's what it narrates is someone going to, I don't think they specify the World Fair, but like going to a performance. They see this woman, she's wearing nothing, or just wearing very little. Her belly button is covered in a red ruby.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It's like this other, right? Like this fascinating woman that, this man is staring at and is narrating his fascination with watching her dance on stage. And then there's this like really gross connotation of him marrying her, and and in that way she's captured. So like the last lyric is that, or like the last couple lines of lyric are that she is mopping his floors with his like 4 kids, and now she doesn't dance here anymore. So there's this thing of like we're introduced to Little Egypt on stage in like her amazing, the spotlight is on her, everyone is staring at her, everyone like admires her. And then it turns into like, and then I got married and we have 4 kids together, she's cleaning my house, and so she stopped dancing. Yeah. And to me, it's just like, that is like heartbreak, like central for me, because it's just like, it's, and again, it shows dominance, and it shows,
yes, exactly,
like male
capture and dominance, conquest.
Totally. Yeah. And this reversal. So again, like, the carbon paper, it's like, I wanted her, so I got her, and I'm like holding her down.
Right.
And you see is this like woman who goes from the stage to a domestic sphere and being quite like low on the hierarchy within the domestic sphere. And so like Little Egypt doesn't dance here anymore. It's poetic, but it's also to me like way too many women's lives and dancers' lives and performers' lives, and just this notion of what you're doing isn't as what you're doing, no matter how empowering it can be, can always be conquered when
But
things
sorry.
Go ahead.
The exchange is so different because the tradition of belly dancing it wasn't about for someone to conquest. Like, so again, when I was researching for the essay for your exhibition, I was very surprised to come across this Mickey Mouse cartoon, The Carnival Kid from 1929, in which again Mickey Mouse woos Minnie Mouse, who's a shimmy dancer at a carnival, which is very much in line with what the Coasters song is and what the Elvis cover is as well. And it's just amazing that it is the Orientalism capture and capture and the sort of flattening of what this kind of character is, and of course of like female sexuality and all of that. I feel like maybe we should see if our anyone wants to ask any questions to Nahed, or just feel free to, you can type them below and we will try to answer them.
I could throw out a fun fact while we're waiting to see if anyone has any questions. So fun fact, the zipper was also premiered in the 1893 World Fair. Right. And I love that because, soon the zipper became incorporated as like a device that allowed for burlesque dancing and other costumes and this like reveal. And anyway, I just really, that was like another moment in research where I was just like, oh wow, like people, this connection between new invention and showing it as this like, look how advanced we are, and the way it gets used is always like really fascinating to me. So I love that. Like, I think we just timed out, but maybe we'll be good about just asking for questions and then we'll log off soon.
Yeah.
Does that sound right?
I thought Instagram just like cut us off. Anyway, you were just saying about about the zipper and the 1893 fair.
Yeah, just to say, just really quickly, became incorporated in costumes for burlesque and other types of dance where movement, like less clothing that confined your body meant more movement, and I just really like that connection there.
Yeah, and kind of closing, I was just thinking that like we keep using like the belly dancer, like the belly, like this figure. She just seems like this kind of amazing platform to discuss so many issues around appropriation, representation, not only of the female body, but of like the other female body, the kind of impacts of Orientalism. And then, as you're saying so much about the American Empire and its own extraction into the Middle East, and the kind of impact it had, not only in terms of appropriating this figure, but also its own presence in the Middle East, and like the furthering of that from the 90s onwards, really, yeah. We're doing these sort of artists, like this artist talk in the middle of something that's quite scary for everybody enduring this kind of pandemic, and a lot of us have the luxury and privilege of being in self-isolation. As we were sort of preparing for this talk, also Nahed, you talked about this the memory that you have of a lockdown, and I wondered if that's something that you wanted to, like an anecdote that you might want to share, just so we're not being totally frivolous and ignoring what's actually happening in the real world.
Yeah, I should just maybe ask everyone, if you have a question, you can go ahead and post it in the comment section or in the question section, and we'll take those questions. Yeah, I mean, Swapna, you're right. Like in, I guess in an early memory is and a defining memory, and experience was. Oh, sorry. 1 second. Should we take this question? Or?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Okay. So it's from Abadar.
Okay.
About how to belly dance for your husband record and takeaway that was in the exhibition. Yeah. So in the exhibition, in the kind of archival materials section, there is a record called "How to Belly Dance for Your Husband," and I guess I didn't necessarily know it existed. I found it in my kind of just research on eBay of just looking for anything related to Little Egypt. So a lot of what I found in this in where I displayed archival material were just like things that I found online. So everything from photographs of like the Board of Lady Managers to early, early photographs of Little Egypt at the fair. But I found this record and I bought it. And when I received it, I opened it up and I found this instructional kind of pamphlet, and it had a step-by-step, I think it's 10 ways to belly dance for your husband. And I found it so many things I find equally, fascinating and ridiculous. And I love that, it is definitely a record that kind of plays in that space. Yeah, and so in this exhibition, unlike the one in Articule, we had photocopied it, and it was like a takeaway that audience members could take with them. Yeah. And
the exhibition that was at Hamilton Artists Inc.
Mm-hmm.
When did that open? And it didn't close because of COVID. We're talking after your exhibition. Yeah. When what were the dates for that?
Ooh, I can't remember the exact dates. I know it opened I think it opened. Well, this year is already such a blur. I think it opened in early February, mid-February, and it closed mid-March, right before we've been all asked to physically distance and isolate.
But you can see images both on your website, nahedmansour.com, and also on hamiltonartistsinc.com. I hope I have that right. And you can see some of the images of the artworks that were included in the exhibition. And you had a selection of archival material and some things from popular culture. Can you talk about what you included?
Yeah, so in the archival material included, I believe 3 archival images of Little Egypt, one of a movie, I think it might have been the Little Egypt movie of Rhonda Fleming, sheet music, which we didn't get to really speak about, but sheet music of a song titled Poor Old Country Maid, which is the Snake Charmer song that we all know. It's da 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 da, which was also made during the time of the World Fair. And that song is its own kind of Little Egypt project on its own in terms of how many times we hear that tune in songs. So sheet music of that song, and then what am I forgetting? Oh yeah, and then DVDs and CDs of different the Coaster song and the Little Egypt movie playing as well. Yeah, so there's a bunch of materials that I've collected that I just show as they are.
Is this body of work ongoing? Are you adding to it?
Yeah, so I just see a question from Samir here that also says, I'm curious about how you are framing your larger practice. Will you make more about Little Egypt and others? So similar to what you're asking, Swapna. Mm-hmm. So Little Egypt, I mean, I've lived with her and all the multiples of her for so long. I think I'm going to be letting her go for just a bit. I still see her all the time. in so much of like what we watch. I'm just like, oh, that's a reference to Little Egypt now that I know what to look for. So whether it's, you know, a dancer who's covering her belly button with a red ruby, or like other small things, like they don't have to name her, but there's all these visual markers of Little Egypt that I'm just seeing everywhere. Yeah, so she's like all around me. But I mean, my next practice, so my previous you know, work was around like tap dance, and I've worked with like Shirley Temple, Bilbo Jangles Robinson, also some Egyptian like iconic dancers, Shirley Hen and Fayrouz. So I'm always kind of looking at both dance forms and icons that represent that form, or like have this connection between power and race in that form. So it's like always entertainment, power, and dance, and just looking for someone who could represent that like triangle really well. So my next question is going to be around ballet and tap dance. And I think Swapna, I mentioned this to you. It's another work that's very much inspired by my VHS, you know, collection. So it's a movie called White Nights. It's amazing. I highly recommend it. It's like a Cold War film starring Gregory Hines, who's an incredible African-American tap dancer, and Baryshnikov, who is like a, you know, a Russian American dancer, and he himself defected to actually Canada and then the States. And anyway, this movie is also a story of a ballet dancer who he plays that defects from the Soviet Union and starts dancing in North America. And at the same time, Gregory Hines, because of racism in America and refusing to fight in the war in Vietnam, he defects from the States and he starts tap dancing in the Soviet Union. And anyway, it's this amazing film about like Cold War politics, race, dance, and there are many amazing dance sequences and with Baryshnikov and Hines that just say so much about entertainment, dance, and power, and this kind of bigger issues of and how dance and politics are like intertwined in this movie are just fascinating. So Baryshnikov and Hines are my next kind of icons.
Amazing.
That I'll be chasing. Yeah.
Are there any other questions that you've seen, Nahed, or
no?
Is there anything else? Is there anything I kind of left out or didn't address?
I think that's a lot.
Yeah.
I think no, I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for
this. Yeah, and again, thank you to Hamilton Artists Inc. And their team there, who've been incredible. And thanks for everyone for logging in and watching this live. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Nahed.
Thank you very much, Swapna. Bye. Hope everyone is safe and doing well.
Yes. Bye.